Good afternoon. I'm really delighted to be here and to get you all excited about Cookstoves, and I really appreciate the really nice introduction from Eric. It sets me up quite well to tell you about why we're different. So as Eric mentioned, I'm the Director of Potential Energy. We're a nonprofit based in Berkeley, nearby, and we work in Sudan and Ethiopia. Our project actually started in Darfur in the height of the conflict there. So I'm going to briefly tell you why cookstoves are important. I won't spend too much time on it since, as Eric mentioned, there are probably a lot of you aware of cookstoves. So the problem with cooking. For those of you who are not aware, nearly half the world is cooking like this woman in this picture here over an open fire inside their home. And this type of cooking is causing 2 million deaths a year. 2 million deaths a year. That's more people than die from malaria. So this is a huge health problem. In terms of the environment, cooking over open fires is very inefficient. So it uses fuel wood inefficiently, and it emits greenhouse gases. In Darfur, where we work, as well as in other places around the world, women often must walk to collect firewood, and they do so at their own risk. They're often attacked and risk their safety. And finally, and perhaps of most immediate urgency to the women themselves, is that many women actually are not within a day's walk of firewood, and they have to purchase wood or charcoal or whatever their fuel might be. And that often comes at a really high price. There have been studies saying that families can spend as much as 1/3 of their income just on firewood for cooking. Now, you might be surprised by this statement, but I'm here as a cookstove seller to tell you that selling cookstoves is not going to solve the problem. The key here is that selling cookstoves that women use will. And Eric alluded to a problem that, there have been a multitude of cookstove projects in the past few decades because this is really a huge problem that needs to be addressed quite urgently. But very few have seen real traction and really gone to scale. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why we're different and how we are going to go to scale. And it all hinges on this key issue that women must use the stoves if we want them to benefit from them and if we want the environment to benefit. So to understand what would motivate a woman to purchase and then use a stove, I'd like to point you to a specific woman that I know from Darfur. Her name is Hawa Badawi. And I met Hawa in 2010 when I was visiting Darfur. And at the time, she was one of these women who was cooking over an open fire. It's called a 3-stone fire, which it literally is 3 stones on the ground in her home with a pot wedged on top, kind of like a campfire. And she also had a mud stove that was kind of cracked, and she sometimes used it, sometimes didn't. Incidentally, she also had a pile of other broken mud stoves in the corner of her house that she didn't use. And she was spending 3 hours a day cooking, and because she lived in a I guess you'd call it urban, but it was in the middle of the desert, not so urban by our standards, but a town, she was someone who had to purchase wood for cooking rather than being able to collect it. And she was an exact example of someone spending 1/3 of her total income. So her family, 1/3 of their income equated to $660 a year that they were spending on firewood. So, as you're probably expecting, I'm going to say, Hawa got a stove, and when we talked to her 8 months after she had received her stove, she told us how proud she was to have a modern, shiny technology in her home. She also said that her time spent on cooking actually reduced to 1 hour per day, if you can believe it. And I think key to our success is that she was saving money. So she cut her expenditure on firewood by about half and was saving at what was going to amount to $350 a year. Now, our stoves last 5 years, and we've had them in the field. We've had them at least 4 years, but based on knowledge of the materials, we're estimating a 5-year average lifespan. So over the course of that 5 years, her stove is going to save her family $1,770. It's quite astonishing if you think about it. I'll get to the cost of getting her the stove in a second. Now, what's really interesting to me, though, is that some women that we've recently done a marketing study, or actually a marketing trial, and we fully expected to have success selling our stoves in urban areas where women were purchasing wood because there's an immediate benefit of offsetting your expenses. But we also tested out in some rural areas where women were collecting wood. And actually, to my surprise, we found out that even women who were not buying wood but were collecting wood bought our stove. And the reason they told us this is, one, they were spending less time collecting wood. They are not so comfortable talking about safety issues, but I assume that's also behind their motivation. But they also said that the stove cooked so fast, it was saving them time actually cooking. So not just the collecting, but the cooking. So I noticed during this trip that they were having trouble pronouncing the official name of the stove, which is the Berkeley-Darfur stove. Yeah, no offense to anyone from Cal in here, but Berkeley is a really hard word to pronounce in foreign language if you're not a native English speaker. So I asked the women to give the stove a name in their Sudanese Arabic. And what they called it was Kanun Hamsa Dagaig, which I'm sure I'm butchering, so apologies to Arabic speakers. But what that means is 5-minute stove. And they gave it that name because it's cooking their food so fast. And that was what was most important to them to highlight in the name of the stove. So we've adopted in our marketing slogan this key focus on money saving and time saving. And we now use this slogan, don't burn your money, buy the 5-minute stove. And it's been successful. So I've talked to you about Hawa, I've talked to you about this global problem, but really what is the market size? So this is Sudan here. It's actually newly Sudan. It used to be pretty much twice that size until quite recently. And Darfur is in the western part of this country. And in Darfur alone, which is where our project started, there are 1 million households that are cooking over in these open fires. So just in this one part of one country, our total theoretical market is 1 million households. We've distributed 22,000 stoves so far, so really just scratching the surface. I should mention, though, that this is one of the hardest places to work in the entire world. I've worked all over Africa, and there's no place like Darfur. We're actually launching a project this year in Ethiopia here, where there's 14.5 million families cooking over open fires using what we call biomass, which is charcoal, wood, dung. And across Africa, the number is 92 million households. And we have goals to eventually expand to other African countries beyond our project in Ethiopia. So it's a serious market opportunity here. Now, I haven't told you much about how the stove works, but it is a wood-burning stove. So the key to it is that it's much more efficient than the open fire. It can save anywhere between 1/2 and 3/4 of the amount of firewood that you would need to cook compared with the 3-stone fire. And that depends on the conditions in cooking. And a lot of people ask us, why not solar, or why wood, or why not alternative fuels? Well, this graph will just answer that right away for you. The IFC of the World Bank recently did a study that just came out, and it showed the market for cook stoves globally and in Africa. And of the 92 million I was telling you, 70 million is for wood stoves. So if we're really going to address this problem, we need to address it with the people cooking with wood first and foremost. Okay, so here's the part where I tell you why we're going to do this differently than everybody else. So here's our competitive landscape, and the two different axes I'm showing you here are the manufacturing scale and utilization. So most cook stove projects to date have really fallen on one end or the other of a spectrum. And on this first end of the spectrum are locally made stoves, often made of ceramic, clay. They're often handmade, and a lot of well-meaning nonprofits teach women to make them, and those women teach other women. Well, there's some problems with this. First of all, going to scale is quite difficult. Second of all, durability with the stoves, very, very poor. In Darfur, we see that the mud stoves that a large multilateral is distributing only last a couple of months, and then they're not replaced. And then the other thing is quality control. So when one woman talks to another and another, the core messages about how to make the stove efficiently are lost, and we've even found some stoves that are less efficient than the open fire, if you can imagine. So that's not really doing a service to the cook stove industry. On the other end of the spectrum, and more recently, a lot of projects have really focused on mass manufactured stoves. These are often made in China, and they have good quality control in the sense that each one is exactly the same. The problem with these stoves is that they don't design for the market. There's maybe 3 models that a company will distribute around the world, a charcoal and a wood, but they don't actually look at what does someone like Hawa need for cooking. So I can give you a specific example. Hawa cooking in Darfur, she uses a round bottom pot as every other woman in Darfur uses. When you put that on a stove like this one, it immediately tips over. It takes 3 women to actually cook, one to hold the stove, one to hold the pot, and one to actually stir. That's just one example. And these aren't high-cost changes that need to be made, but they're changes that need to be made if you expect a woman to use the stove and you don't want it to be used as a garbage bin in the corner of the home, which we often see. So, of course, when anyone shows a slide like this, you're expecting our products to appear in the top corner there, and I will not disappoint. So here we are. Our stoves are both customized for the market and they're mass-produced. And as a result, we've achieved 100% adoption based on our rigorous user surveys and statistical analysis. We can say that of the 22,000 stoves that have been distributed, they're in use. So how does this work? So as I said, the customer is center, and for today, that's Hawa. We translate her core needs into a specialized design, and we work with the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory for R&D, so we take the best science and engineering in the world and bring it to bear to solve this problem. Then we do a stamping out of flat kits. So our stoves that we distribute in Darfur are stamped in India in flat sheets of metal, kind of like you would expect IKEA furniture. They're delivered as flat packs. And then we've set up local assembly, where we employ 13 people from a nearby displacement camp. So we're providing job opportunities. And I should mention that the great thing about the mass manufacturing is that we keep costs low, particularly transportation costs, and keep the quality high. And finally, I haven't left myself too much time to talk about distribution, but we work with local community organizations that work already in the communities where we operate in Darfur, and they provide a rent-to-own model. We provide the working capital, and so women are able to pay just a small amount, 1/4 of the total stove price up front, and then with the money that they're saving by their reduction in firewood expenses, they're able to pay off the stove in 4 months, and then the stove keeps saving them money for the next 5 years. And actually, they could theoretically pay their stove off in 1 month based on the firewood savings, but we'd like to give them extra time. Okay, so here are the key pieces to our strategy. The world-class R&D through our partnership with LBL, the flat kit manufacturing, our focus on measurement. I mentioned briefly that we've done a lot of user surveys. We're in the process of rolling out small sensors on a subset of stoves that will actually measure when the stoves are being used and get hot, and that provides us with a way to measure the validity of the user self-reported data. And core to our approach is understanding the user and what her motivation for changing her behavior would be. So all of these have enabled us to get our costs pretty down. So here, I know, Bob, you'll really like this slide. This is our unit economics. In Darfur, we've got our cost, end-to-end cost, to get the stove in a hand of a woman, including margin at the different parts of the value chain. It's about a little bit over $16 right now, and the most of that is $11 in the actual stamping of the kits. And we've actually already identified ways to reduce that $11 by about 30%, and we're in the process of going through those iterations. As I mentioned, we're launching in Ethiopia this year. You might wonder, if we haven't fully achieved scale, why are we going to Ethiopia? Well, Darfur is one of the riskiest places in the world to operate. It's essentially become our beta test, and we're looking at Ethiopia as our first real market. We already know through the research we've done that the price point there is lower, and we've identified ways to get our costs down. We're going to do manufacturing in country, and we believe we can get to economies of scale much quicker, and the transportation costs will also be lower. So we're projecting that our costs will be $8 when we fully launch in Ethiopia next year. Okay, so here are all my numbers that you probably can't read, but here's the key point. I'm using Ethiopia as an example because it's more emblematic of our future plan to scale rather than the more philanthropic model we used in Darfur. So by 2017, we plan to be selling 80,000 stoves, and that's just a very small percent of the market. We have 2 sources of revenue. One is the stove sales themselves, and the other is carbon credits. And for skeptics out there, I should say that we're in the process of negotiating this carbon credit deal, and it will be locked in for 7 years with a fixed price. And it's based on a deal we already have in Darfur that's working. So we're not too dependent on the carbon markets once we get this locked in. And finally, you can see that we plan to break even in 2015, and then we eventually plan to spin this off as a self-sustaining model. So we here in the US will remain a nonprofit, but we hope to create independent, self-sustaining for-profits in the countries where we work. So I'm just going to go through quickly our history. We started as a project at UC Berkeley. We raised $500,000 while there. That was mostly for R&D, and we made some stoves locally at that time. Then we spun out, realizing that a university is not the ideal place to run a social enterprise in Darfur. So we became Potential Energy, raised another $500,000, and that's when we moved to this flat kit manufacturing approach and produced almost 14,000 stoves, 13,650. This year, 2012, has been a real turning point for us. We just got a grant from USAID's Development Innovation Ventures for $1.5 million. That will enable us to go to scale in Darfur and then in Ethiopia to do R&D. And as you saw, we need about $900,000 for Ethiopia. I don't have much time to go into our team, but suffice it to say that we have a lot of experience in microfinance, mechanical engineering. Our board is very heavy-hitting. We have great DNA. Our founder, Ashok Gadgil, is a senior scientist at LBL. We have serial entrepreneurs, folks who used to be at the Skoll Foundation. Okay, let me just get these all up there. We do measure the particulate matter, that's the health impacts, the firewood conserved, and the reduction, women's self-reported reduction in firewood trips. But most importantly, we look at how much money women are saving. To date in Darfur, that's more than $20 million. And I can tell you of the money that we received as grants last year, every dollar donated to us resulted in $18 in the hands of a woman in Darfur in terms of firewood savings. Okay, here's our summary. You must design for the user. We have near 100% adoption. We're ready to go to Ethiopia. We know we have things to learn about distribution there. We're seeking $900,000 to help us get to scale, to cash flow positive, and to really have an impact there. And then we will take this successful model and stamp it out in additional countries within sub-Saharan Africa. It has a huge impact on health, livelihoods, and the environment. I hope you will join us. I hope I have convinced you that we are the Cookstove project that will succeed. And I hope you will be with us as we reach out and reach millions of women in Africa, one meal at a time.